I'm Garrett McQueen,
I'm Scott Blankenship.
and this is Trilloquy, True and Real Stories from the Fringes of Classical Music. All right, Scott, so this is actually our first two-parter. So on the last opus of Trilloquy, I had a conversation with Maestro Brandon Keith Brown. For folks who happen not to catch the last opus of Trilloquy, how about you bring them up to speed?
Last time on Trilloquy, Brandon
Okay,
Keith Brown.
okay.
You never let me do anything I want to. So last time we talked with Brandon Keith Brown, who has, as he mentioned, not only does his color precede him in his work when he goes to conduct an orchestra, there's also some things that he's written that have preceded him in that way. His story about working at Brown University and being fired from there, and here we are.
Yeah. So right now he's over in Germany where he's, had the opportunity to conduct a number of orchestras. He's even traveled beyond Germany at this point, as you may have heard in the last opus of Trilloquy. And in this conversation, I sit with him and talk about a few things. We discuss the implications of race in Germany, how race relates with class, which I thought was really interesting. And we, even end up actually getting to talk about a little music because, after all, it is classical music that he loves, and even his take on that, the discussion of the canon, I thought
Mm.
was pretty interesting. What did you think, Scott?
You know how when a few opuses ago, when Kalena Boval was on,
Mm-hmm.
she told a story about a young black boy that went up and was like mimicking her on the podium
Sure,
and how
sure.
he improved.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk a lot about that on the podcast about how if you see someone doing something that looks like you, then you go, okay, this is for me and I can, be interested or want to
Sure,
do this.
sure.
He brought up a really good point about being there in the concert hall that I hadn't thought of. And, I feel um, kind of silly that I didn't think of the perspective. If you have a black conductor on the podium, then perhaps he wouldn't be asked to move in the concert hall, that got into your conversation about being, what is acceptable behavior,
Oh, sure.
if you are seen as, oh, you like classical music or you're a conductor, then you're not a threat.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I really think that there's something there that people pay attention to that part of the conversation.
Yeah. So, as I may have said, may or may not have said before we got into the conversation on the last opus, some things may be challenging, but I really encourage you to really take his perspective as his truth and what we really need to listen to, not judge, but really take and learn what we can from it to help us make this world of so-called classical music a little more equitable and equal for us all. So here we go with part two of my conversation with Maestro Brandon Keith Brown. Maestro Brown, it's great to have you back here on Trilloquy. And as this airs, it's actually your birthday. So happy birthday, Brandon.
Oh, thank you very much.
It must be difficult to celebrate a birthday under all of these circumstances, but I hope you have a good one nonetheless.
I like the solitude, so it's not bad, but, I wish I could go out a little more, but nothing's open except the grocery store.
Sure, sure. And a lot of folks here are really curious about the way this COVID-19 pandemic is impacting life over on that side of the pond. But would you mind quickly just providing a perspective on that?
Well, as an artist, I've had an engagement canceled in May, so a lot of us are worried about engagements if you're a freelance artist. Luckily, Germany feels and knows that art is essential. They've already lost billions of dollars. It came out in the paper. They feel they're going to lose even more from not having, concerts. The Bayreuth Festival has been canceled for the summer. Everything is being canceled. However, the Federal Republic is providing grants basically for all artists. They have these multi-million-dollar grants that they have passed, and everybody can apply for small €5,000 grants to help get them through a few months of this.
Mhm.
So that's the same thing I think everybody all over the world is experiencing. There's in Berlin, in Germany, it's not like you go to the store always and they have lots of food. Like when things run out, they run out and they
Sure.
don't replace them. Like in America, I doubt you're going to have food shortages, but there's not a lot of food on the shelf. Of course, there's absolutely no toilet paper, but where in the world can you find toilet paper today?
Yeah.
It's gone. People have hoarded it, but and there's of course no sanitizer. But a lot of the stores you go to, they just run out of things. So I try to go to stores on the peripheral. I go to the Turkish markets. They tend to have food because not everybody's shopping at the Turkish
Mm.
markets and the Turkish neighborhoods. So that's a really good idea for anybody in Germany who's going to listen to this podcast is to go to the Turkish neighborhoods.
Sure, sure.
Um, and I don't go out. I mean, less people are on the train. I have asthma and I have allergies, and so I'm really quite frightened of this. But luckily, Chancellor Merkel and the government of Germany has been taking this very seriously with lots of testing,
Mm.
and they've shut everything down. All of the hairdressers, everything will be closed until the 20th of April. I think that will probably be extended as well.
We'll be sure to stay safe over there. So,
Thank
so,
you.
so, folks who may not have heard part one of our conversation on the last opus of Trilloquy, you sort of went through your background and how that led you to Brown University, and then the story about your infamous firing from that institution. So now we're in the present. You're over there across the pond in Europe, in Germany. And an interesting question was posed to me. So I'm sure you're familiar with Josephine Baker and her story of leaving the United States for France because she just couldn't artistically express herself without the cloud of racism over her here in the state. So she went over there to live the rest of her life. Does that idea, does that philosophy apply to your journey to Europe at all? I thought that was an interesting connection that someone made with me.
Well, I just want to be honest with you. I'm generally aware of Nina Simone. I'm somewhat more aware of James Baldwin, but I'm not
Sure.
specifically aware of Josephine Baker's story.
Well, it's
And
the same
so,
as James Baldwin's
well,
story is his, yeah.
I'm sure that all of us are similar to a degree because um, it's a similar story with Dean Dixon. It's a similar story with George Burt. Dean Dixon was the famous conductor who was the first conductor. He was chief conductor of the Frankfurt Radio Orchestra. George Bird, from my home state of North Carolina, was the first conductor to conduct the Gewandhaus Orchestra. Dean Dixon conducted at the Wiener Stadtoper, and this was all during the 1960s,
Mm,
by the way. And both of these people, George Bird left Juilliard because of racism, and he went to Paris Conservatoire, then studied with Carillon and became a protege of Carillon. And then Dean Dixon left also, and then he became music director in Australia and lots of places. But he didn't conduct in the United States until like the last 2 years of his life. So it's a similar sort of African American. Um, there's an African American diaspora in Europe of artists, classical artists, out of necessity. Same thing with Hazel Harrison. I don't know if
right.
we mentioned that last time.
You sure did,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, okay, the pianist. So it's always a similar story. We come here because I think this because there's not the history of racism. The fact that in America we were animals basically until the end of the Civil War was 1865, and we became citizens in 1868. And so at least coming here, we were human, which allowed us to be looked at as artists much more readily. And I think, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, I think it was something very interesting to have African American classical artists come, especially if you were very good. It was something very interesting. In my particular case, Germany was the first country to validate my talent through the Schulte competition,
Mm,
and I it was a big deal at the time. I don't think it's a big deal now, but it still carries a lot of clout with German orchestras. It's a type of elevation when you mention that, or when you apply for something, or when you conduct. They see it in your bio, and so to have my talent and ability validated here meant an immense amount to me. Then I started getting engagements with very good orchestras, what we consider A-level orchestras by the size and budget of the orchestra,
Mhm.
and also quality, where none of that happened in America. And to be fair, I always like to look at things as well-rounded as I possibly can. Americans have a tendency to be very snotty towards American conductors, and so the thing is, we're supposed to go to Europe, get a career, and then come back, and then we'll be more accepted. Um, this happens for a handful of white conductors who are able to do that very successfully, but it really doesn't happen with the black ones
Hmm.
so much. Of course, we're less in number, and we're given less opportunities because we haven't been granted access to the center of classical music culture in America. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it's just much easier here um, to have your art validated. It doesn't mean that I start from zero when I step on the podium. I still have a lot more to prove than my white colleagues, and there are
Right,
problems,
you
and
start
a
below
lot.
0, just to be
Of
clear
course,
to yeah.
we start below zero. We always have to work at least twice as hard or three times as hard. Um, but uh, you know, but when you finally get to conduct and show something, I like to think that people are giving me a chance. I call myself an optimistic realist. I want good things to happen. I realize most of the time they don't, but I think the orchestras here are much more open. I know that they're much more open to black talent, because there's been a number of young African American conductors that have come here who've held positions and guest conducted. There's a lot of problems, of course, with racism in Germany every day, all the time. Lots of things that are going on. But music, I think one of the biggest things, and I'm starting to be annoyed by this, when you tell somebody you're a conductor, it elevates you immediately to the highest social status. And it's very annoying because I could be a concert audience member and they don't want to sit next to me, and they move their chair and they move their purse over if they're a woman because they're afraid I might steal it.
Sure.
And then they talk to me or something, or they see me with the score, and they suddenly their faces light up and they smile, because they feel safer somehow. It's just like that since it seems like I'm cultured, that I'm less likely to rob them,
Yeah,
basically.
you're a safe
I'm safe.
Negro.
Exactly, and I've been reading a lot. I read a lot about sociology, and I was reading an article, a sociologist article. I won't get into details, but she gave a vignette about a black man, and he was a business person, and he said every time he got stopped by the police, he would turn on Vivaldi's Four Seasons.
It's funny that you say that because I've tended to do the same thing when I've been pulled over by the police. I think the last time I was pulled over, I turned on some Hindemith, though, to be fair.
Whenever I went to the Peoria, wherever I went to the Peoria Symphony, and I have no problem saying this because my second year in the Peoria Symphony, I just got stopped by the police every time I went, and finally I quit the orchestra. I mean, I was pulled over in the Krispy Kreme parking lot after, because they had the hot light on, right?
Right,
The hot
yeah.
light in
Oh,
Krispy Kreme.
of
Okay,
course.
you have to go. So, and I'm from North Carolina, so
Yeah.
come on. And so I got pulled over by undercover cops in a soccer mom minivan in the Krispy Kreme drive-through, and that was really pretty much the last time. But I always had classical music, blasting, because that's the
Yeah.
only music that so that's the experience that I have as a black conductor in Germany. it's a different experience, but I shouldn't have to tell people I'm a conductor in order to be respected, you know?
Right, and, the safety that people feel when they see you are a part of the classical, music profession, that safety, that camaraderie, as I don't have to tell you, does not always, come when you're in the mix of it, and you've written and talked so much about, the intrinsic racism within classical music, over in Germany, and we're gonna get into that here in a bit. But one thing you said that struck a chord with me. You talked about the essential nature of the arts in Germany, and these funds that are being put out. When we talked about the difficulties you had at Brown, you talked about how they treat it just sort as a sort of club, and then how that culture sort of permeates the arts in the United States in general as this extra thing, as this thing that goes, on top of the things that are actually essential. Does the culture of the arts being more essential in Germany absolve some of the racial challenges within classical music culture, or does it multiply them?
Well, that's a good question. What we have to think about, there's a major difference is that the people of color population in Germany is much smaller than it is in America,
Sure.
and there isn't the history of the civil rights movement. You know, the black population here, I believe, is 1%, and in America, it's a little over 12%. And so most of the people around you every day are white. And I talk to white musicians and white friends. They say they never see any black people at all
Hmm.
in their lives, which is true because the black people live in Wedding and certain areas. So I think a better thing to talk about is the differences between class and quite frankly, I'm not so well read on the sociology of class because it gets extremely complicated. I
Sure.
think it's easier to look at the relationship between classical music and class and racism in America because class often parallels racism, racial
Exactly.
issues, and so it's
Exactly.
easy to hypothesize. But in Europe, in Germany, they don't take a racial census, and so you don't have the data so much on race, and so I have to go off of experience. But if we want to talk about classism, my very first concert that I did in Karlsruhe with the Badische Staatskapelle, which is a very large theater, um, it was in a church, and there were farmers sitting upstairs, you know,
Yeah.
with the farmers' hats. And then downstairs, you had, people that were a lot more formally dressed and this sort of thing. And obviously, those tickets were more expensive and that sort of thing. Um, if you ask a homeless German person on the street, do you know who Wagner is? They probably will know who Wagner is. And I was talking to a British friend, and she said Britain is not like that, and we know America is not like that either.
Sure.
They wouldn't even know how to say his name. Um, the thing is that these people a lot of these composers came from Germany, and music. There's over 100. I think there's 132 orchestras in Germany. Nearly every town has some sort of orchestra. They heard an orchestra from a very early age. They may not like classical music, but they know it by proximity,
Right. Right.
to the orchestras. They know Bayreuth is it's something to be coveted. They know the Berlin for they well, I'm not giving my opinion, but they know and feel that the Berlin Philharmonic is one of the absolute, best orchestras in the world, or it's the best orchestra in the world. They know that. They know about certain orchestras, but they don't even have to step foot in the hall. And we don't have that in America because the classical music is imported. And when you import something, it loses a lot of its essentiality.
So for classical music to be such an institutional pillar there, it must be all that more difficult to challenge the culture.
Well, German culture is hard to challenge because basically Germany is the land of Germans, and they really want to maintain their culture as being the only culture. And so the the idea is that, the chancellor just asked this question, and I like her very much, but she asked the question after the Hanau massacre, where all these Turkish people were killed in a hookah joint by some right wing guy who was after blacks, Asians, and Turkish. He said he wanted to get everyone. And the Chancellor Merkel asked, at what point does someone become German? Because she understands in the discourse that Turkish people are not counted as German. Really, only people who are, white are counted as German. But I say that's not the right question to ask. The question is, why should you want us to assimilate and integrate? Why should we all have to be imitation German? Why can't we take our culture with us? Why can't we take our cultural repertoire and our narrative with us and have it honored? And in Germany, unfortunately, German culture does not allow for people to retain their culture like many societies. America has a lot of problems, but you come to America only speaking Spanish, and you can live your whole life in America only speaking Spanish, and or mostly Spanish. You could become a citizen still speaking mostly Spanish, and you can't do that in Germany. There isn't this. There isn't. In my opinion, I wrote an article on this on the word multiculti because people like to claim Berlin is so multiculti just because Berlin has lots of types of people.
As
But
in
those people,
multicultural.
multicultural, yes. Thank you. Genau. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. As in lots of different types of people, but actually these people don't aren't friends together and they're not accepted. Um, but these people aren't allowed to retain who they are when they move to Germany, and that's the biggest problem that keeps Germany from reaching its full potential. Its superpower, Germany's superpower, is classical music. It is by far, they have a sickness for classical music. You will not believe the number of concerts. There's 7 full-time orchestras in Berlin. Where else is that the case? Maybe
Nowhere I can
Tokyo
think
has.
of. Sure.
Tokyo has a lot, but this is extraordinary. 3 full-time opera companies, 3 massive full-time opera companies. So classical music is a sickness, but if they could use this, the fact that music connects, music is meant to connect people and to share empathy and develop empathy between people that are not like us, you know, if they could use that to fight their greatest scourge, which is racism, in my opinion, this country would, oh my God, it would definitely be one of the best countries in the world.
How could those organizations begin to do that if the people are not there, if the musicians aren't in the orchestra, or as I'm sure you would agree, if the black folks are not on the podium? How can that conversation even begin?
Well, it's a similar thing with the United States. I mean, people have to be willing to become comfortable with being very, very uncomfortable. After Hanau happened, not one orchestra went to Hanau to play, and not one orchestra had a specific concert in honor of the Hanau victims. And for me, it made me angry because that was a really big lost opportunity to show how only music can rebuild trust, how music can best, in my opinion, help people grieve, and how music can bring us together in times of great pain. And, if an orchestra had gone to the community and had a concert, think about who would come to the concert. White people would come, Turkish people would come. They would come and communicate together. And maybe they wouldn't speak, who knows? But they would stand side to side together. There would at least be this proximity and this fellowship through sound, And I know maybe that sounds naive and it sounds, like purple prose or whatever. But that's the job of music. That's the job of musicians. That's the job of orchestras. That's what we should be doing when these types of things happen. And so we had this massacre that divided German society so much, and people were so upset and angry about this. And then, in a few months, people are going to forget all about it. This virus is happening now. It's being spoken of much less by mainstream media, but the problems are still there. And even now, you have the exacerbation of Asians and Asian musicians who are being attacked,
Right.
literally attacked, physically, verbally. Lots of anti-Asian propaganda that is on the internet. Um, a cellist, Eugene Lipschitz, the solo cello of the Hamburg Symphonica, wrote that something like Italy is in its condition because they had quote unquote helpers or help from China, and that this was the Chinese virus. And he did this yesterday. It's all over Facebook. It's everywhere. The orchestra gave a very tone deaf response that had nothing to do with the racial implications of what he said. And the Shanghai Quartet fired their second violinist for making racial comments about the Chinese and the virus, which I think is a good thing to do. But I don't think this orchestra is going to fire him, which is the best thing to do, to say, no, we don't support people who are racist. Taxpayers shouldn't support people who are racist because the orchestras are funded by taxpayers. So now Asians are getting a lot of the same racism that Black people get every day, that we get all the time, but that's not being covered in the media. It's not. And so if people in power have to be willing to become very comfortable with being uncomfortable and discuss systemic racism.
And if I may say, you are very comfortable with making people uncomfortable, especially through the many articles you write, the very pointed pieces that you write that really point out issues like you've laid out. The racism we're seeing against Asian musicians now. The racism that's always been there against Black and Brown individuals. When you think about your catalog of writings, is there one that you think is a real standout, or one that you would really hope more people could digest and consume so that they understand more of what you're talking about and trying to call out?
Oh gosh, uh,
I know it's like
you know,
asking your favorite child, but
well, no, not really, because I consider myself like such a baby writer, and that I have to ask permission from people. Um, the article that I recently wrote on deservingness in classical music.
yeah,
This article was talking about my journey, or my I'm still on this journey. I'm not in the road of trying to justify that I'm deserving enough to be in this field without white people telling me that I am. And it talks about how white people define who is deserving, who is in and who is out of classical music society. And it talks about how if we keep allowing only white people to decide, um, Black people won't ever be allowed in the center. And it also talks about the fact that Black people are taught, we're mostly taught in white schools by white teachers, classical music in particular. We're taught by white teachers, and we are ingratiated with the idea that whites are the sole arbiters of classical music. And even though we may not say that, but it's subconscious. It's just like the media's influence, where we go to school, our schooling, our teachers. We have subconscious lessons, sociological lessons that we learn, and this has an effect on our confidence, and therefore it also has an effect on our performance and our potential. If we constantly have to question ourselves, and we constantly have to wonder if we're deserving to be in this profession, if we're good enough. These are a lot of the questions that my white conducting colleagues in graduate school at Peabody and many other programs, they didn't have to ask those questions. They just felt entitled to be in the profession. And I think I've accomplished a certain number of things now, but I just never felt like I felt entitled to do anything in music. I looked at it as very much a privilege. And I've written a lot about, I didn't have enough confidence even to apply for jobs until I met David Zimmern in 2009.
right.
So honestly, I just started writing. Every time I write, it feels like I'm writing into a vacuum. I always feel like what I'm writing isn't relevant, that nobody will read it. Or sometimes with the article that I wrote on Black concert trauma, on the Black experience going to concerts, my experiences are so ubiquitous among Black people
Mhm.
that I thought Black people would just roll their eyes and go to the next. And it ended up being this viral sensation within 4 days. This article um, talking about the common experiences that we've always had going to opera and orchestra. So I never know what is going to be interesting and popular to people. I write from my own experience and perspective. I try to write through the Black community. I don't represent necessarily the
Of
Black community.
course, yeah.
I don't want to wear that hat, but I do write through the Black experience. And something else that I should add also, you have to understand that I before Brown, I didn't talk about racism so much. Um, I didn't talk about the racial problems and issues that I had. A lot of it I didn't even see, and I didn't notice these things. It wasn't until Brown where I realized fully, even though I had experiences where police had put guns to my head at the traffic stop for no reason, just run up to my car and put guns to my head. I had lots of traumatic racial experiences, but I didn't realize until Brown that my color precedes my talent. And that sounds very stupid, but I'm finding a lot of people are the same with me, especially in classical music. There's a lot of Black people that are like, why can't you? You're so talented. Why do you talk about these things? Why are you doing this? Because the next time I'm not making the situation any better for myself in this profession if I remain silent and complicit in racism. What am I going to do? Wait for another Brown University situation where I'm told the very first day we hired you because you're Black and not given any agency in the position, have students that physically assault me, and just be fired because the white students didn't want to have discipline within the orchestra and nobody observed my classes. And then there's a huge media frenzy where the dean says that I wasn't doing my job and all of these things, and he's allowed to do it because he's white in the position of power. And also Brown is an institutionally racist organization because they were founded with slaves, and they have a diversity program which is basically trying to counteract the bad media of that came out about it being found out to it was founded by the sale of slaves. So I didn't research this. I didn't research the demographics of the faculty or the students. These things were my fault because I didn't understand that my race comes first. And I think a lot of Black people, they know this and they understand this and they realize this very early on. And God knows I was told this, but it really, really didn't change me until after this experience. And so now, years later, 3 years from now, I can say in a way it was a good thing. But I don't want anyone out there to think, oh, Brennan's always been this, seemingly self-righteous, and he speaks out and he knows all about these things. That's just not true. It's
And I'm
not true at all.
and I'm sure, many of your critics will say, you talk a lot about racism and all of these problems, but what about the music? Well, I want to ask you, what about the music? I mean, in your perfect world, if you could draw the picture for what your experience as a Black conductor could be, what would be that experience for you?
Well, I wish that one day I could perform all of who I am, and instead of being judged through a racist lens. I wish that could happen with any orchestra um, that I go to. I mean, that's just not going to happen um, in my lifetime. Even though meritocracy doesn't work in society. Meritocracy, of course, um, isn't functioning in classical music. It has nothing to do with how good you are. The position you get has nothing necessarily how good you are. It's a lot of political things that go into it. But I think I'm like every other artist in the sense that I really want to be valued first and foremost for the art that I produce and the sound that I create. I don't know if necessarily there's a benchmark. Of course, we want to make a living doing this.
Mhm.
We want to conduct as much as possible, and we want to make music. We want to be allowed to make music on the highest level. I think that there's a concern that, um, you know, there's never been a black music director of a major American orchestra, at least a top 15, and I believe top 20 American orchestra. And either we're inept or something needs to change. Something really needs really need to look at why that is. When you can look at Germany, which has a um, also a rather abhorrently racist past and still has a lot of racist problems, but yet Dean Dixon was able to be chief of Frankfurt,
Mhm.
and you also had Hazel Harrison, as we talked about before, the pianist that performed the Berlin Philharmonic in 1903. So you have all of these exceptions. Germany has made all of these consistent exceptions for African American artists, and America hasn't. And that's something we really need to look at. So, and ideally, I would love to be looked at for my art first and foremost over race, and I think that just makes me the same with any other artist.
But it seems like really centering the, you mentioned the exceptions that they have allowed. Centering those exceptions to many would elicit the response, "You see, we don't have problems. We have Brandon Keith Brown doing the Black History Month program." Exceptions like those. Why is it, or would you say that centering the conversation and disqualifying racism around those exceptions, why surely you would say that that is, inappropriate to do, to write off the historical and contemporary racist practices based on those exceptions.
Garrett, orchestras will have worked towards equality when they give us access to the Western canon. When we're conducting the canon for subscription concerts, the center of classical music, what inspired me and what has inspired many people to become conductors, to become professional classical musicians, um, what we've studied mostly in school, if they give us access to the canon, for instance, conducting the Wagner opera at the Met, conducting Rigoletto in lyric, conducting La Boheme, conducting these central pieces, that sends a message that we've gained cultural access. It sends a message to the orchestra, it sends a message to the organization, it sends a message to the audience, and it sends a message to society. So, if you have a conductor who's doing Wagner at lyric or lyric opera, for example, what does that tell the audience? It makes the audience feel a little bit different about little old Brandon Brown sitting next to them when the conductor is black in the pit. I might not have had, I wrote about the lady who asked me to go sit somewhere else at the lyric opera, in that article, that piece I wrote. If there was somebody black on stage conducting, maybe she would have thought, it's kind of interesting. I mean, maybe it would have been a different dynamic, or maybe she wouldn't have came at all.
Right, right.
Maybe she wouldn't have want to see that. And I'm laughing, but that's also a big fear of administrators, because I've had administrators tell me, "Listen, Brandon, our audience is old and white, and there's just really no way to market you." I mean, I've been told that over the phone by an orchestra in Florida, actually. Um, so I know that they don't hire us for those reasons, but then when you put us on stage, there's probably a number of people that will never come, of course, because we're there. But once we're granted access and trusted with the canonical repertoire, we're starting to reach towards equality of engagements in classical music. This thing that is completely codified by white supremacy, de facto, because all the people who make the decisions for anything, what is high art, what is good, what is bad, are white, and they fought to keep it this way, and they've made it this way on purpose. And so once we're given access, I believe, to this sacred canon, I think that we'll start to see equality. And I'm not saying that just in my interest as a conductor, because this is really like the repertoire that we want to do, and it's wonderful to do Martin Luther King concerts, everything, but you end up working 1 month out of the year mostly. It's a joke amongst all of us black conductors. That's when we're most employed.
Right.
And we do Fourth of July and family concerts and things like this with major orchestras. But why aren't we being asked to do the Bruckner Symphony or the Mahler Symphony?
So so
You
would you
know,
so would you consider broadening the canon a solution to this? What if Duke Ellington was put on the same pedestal, if it's ever possible, as the Bach and the Beethoven? Is widening the canon a possible solution, or do you think, it's just necessary to I don't know. It's difficult for me, Brandon, because I feel like there is implicit bias in maintaining the canon, if that makes sense. In saying that this Bruckner symphony is intrinsically better and higher art than this William Grant Still symphony.
hmm well, you've got a good point there. It, it I think I am under the same um, type of have the same ideology that if it's something that's hundreds of years old, and it's Bruckner's not, but Mozart and
Mhm.
these old composers that have stood the test of time, that there is this firmness of legs, that these pieces are able to walk around longer and they're able to go farther in distance. And so there's a lot of problems, I think, in my training and in the training of a lot of artists that have been under this sort of very conservative, conservatory um, type of thinking, that we do prize certain genres over other ones. In my case, it's out of ignorance because I don't play a lot of that music and I don't conduct a lot of that music. I know that's odd, but in Germany, they don't ask me to do only one orchestra has asked me to do American orchestras, American music.
Mhm.
They've asked me to do. They've asked me to do Bruckner, my first Bruckner symphony. I thought they were out of their mind, but it actually went well, and I fell in love with deeper love with Bruckner. And they asked me to do Mozart. They asked me to do Beethoven. They asked me to do. They don't even bat an eye. It's not even a question. Um, I will tell you this: there is a pigeonholing of repertoire that a lot of conductors, black conductors, resent, and I think that has caused a lot of us to be a little bit wary.
Hmm.
When we start to be only asked to do Bernstein, only asked to do Gershwin, only asked to do William Graham Still, only asked to do these type of composers, and then we say, can we do Dvorak? No, we can't. No, no, this is not. That's too. That's you're asking too much. Or Copeland, or Copeland, and of course these are all extraordinary
Right, of
composers.
course.
But when you're asked to do only those, and you say, "Can I please bring my Mozart?" and you're suddenly not trusted enough to program it, you start to become very, very wary of what you're doing. And this is true. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but a lot of Americans, when you come to Germany, were asked immediately to do American music. I have been very, very, very lucky. I am one of the rare cases where I was never asked early. My first concert was Karl Amadeus Hartmann, Wagner, and Poulenc, and nothing to do at all with American music. And I'm never even questioned to do American music. But it's just like French conductors. French conductors get pigeonholed to do French music
Sure.
because nobody else, a lot of people don't want to do it because it's really hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard to conduct,
Sure.
and it's hard to put together with the orchestra, and they say, "Oh, the French," but then the French conductors, they want to conduct American music, of
Right,
course,
right.
because they love jazz and they're really great at doing jazz, and they want to do jazz and they want to do Bruckner and Brahms, and then they don't get to do it. And so I think I have a fear of being pigeonholed, and so that's one of the reasons why I may project this favoritism for these old things. I know I'm not the only one, but you're right. the canon really needs to be fought. I mean, I consider Gershwin, American Paris. It's a part of a canon, but it's not part of the old 18th century
Right, right.
canon, which has more of the roots of music, in it. It's on the branches from. I consider it as part of the branches of the base of the tree.
So as you move forward, as the situation at Brown, becomes less and less a definitive part of who you are, when if folks don't know you personally, as you continue to travel the world, leading these incredible orchestras and growing your profile as one of the world's most significant conductors. What is your message to people? What do you have to say to those who still doubt the relationship between race and classical music and the negative impact that you have personally experienced from it and the negative impact that countless other black conductors experience from that culture worldwide?
Well, I help them with German orchestras. I speak very frankly, and when I sit down with the director or the intendant, I tell them, I'm an activist in classical music, and we start talking about race, and they say, "Oh, we don't think about those things." And I said, "Well, when's the last time you've seen a black conductor on the cover of a CD?" And they're like, "Never." And I have never seen one in my life. Maybe you have, Garrett. Um,
I don't know that I have
but
maybe James DePriest, but other than
but
that,
that was
no.
long ago, and he's
Right.
not. And we
Yeah,
in
rest in
Germany we
peace to
have.
him, yeah.
Yes, in Germany, we have CD stores. I don't think they have CD stores in
Not so
America
much
anymore,
anymore, no.
but they still have them in Germany. It's a big deal. They're big, and like Dussmann, and it's all Deutsche Grammophon. It's all white artists, white Asian artists typically, um, and they're like, okay. And I said, and would you wake up in the morning and think of me conducting a Bruckner symphony? And normally they laugh and they go, no, I wouldn't let you do a Bruckner symphony. And they just, some of them are really honest because they say, well, we just wouldn't think of a black person doing a Bruckner symphony. You have to be old and white, and have an accent. And that's where I get them. And that's where I'm able to start, having a dialogue. Well, this is implicit bias that you have. It doesn't mean necessarily that, I'm not able to produce a convincing performance in Bruckner or what have you because of what country I come from and my race and ethnicity, necessarily. So honestly, the conversations that I've had, and I have them always, always with orchestras that have decided to hire me, where they call me and they say, we want to hire you. I tell them. And with orchestras that I'm approaching, because I want them to hire me.
Mhm.
Because my feeling now after Brown is that I want people to be comfortable with who I am and with who I am as a person and with who I am as an artist. And if you can't talk about racism, you'll never be comfortable with me.
Right.
You won't be
As we've
comfortable
said
because this
before,
is
you're
my
always
reality.
black, yeah.
Yes, I'm always black. But this is something black artists don't realize, and white artists certainly don't. But this is something a lot of black artists don't realize. They think, oh God, if I talk about race first and foremost, they're never going to hire me again, and all of this sort of stuff. But there's so many things that are against them when they step in the door. If the slightest thing goes wrong and it doesn't work out, you're going to be judged far more harshly than the other young white conductor who's given so many more chances because he's relatable to the orchestra administration and the maestro. The music director of the orchestras typically brought them in because they had a relationship of relatability. Um, so I always talk about it. When I went to South Africa, it was very easy
Mhm.
because they really encouraged me. The director there was like, "You must talk about this. Please stop." The players, I thought it was really touching because I was in my dressing room before the second concert, and musicians came in three, and they said, "Thank you so much for the week with us. Please don't stop talking about racism. We need you to do this. We need you to keep doing this. Don't stop. Don't be discouraged by." And I was like, okay. I mean, it really threw me off guard. It's 5 minutes before the concert.
There's
And
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, it was. it was let me know that I'm going in the right direction, because obviously when I'm writing articles and things like this, you're writing into darkness and you're not sure if it's really resonating. Now I'm starting to get some feedback. In particular, I want to get feedback from the Black community, because I don't want to um, feel like I'm speaking for all of Black people,
Mhm.
because that's. But the thing is, people say, "Well, I don't feel that way." Well, if you say that you don't feel that way, what you're doing is individualizing racism as a system. You're saying that racism is an event, that it didn't, because this didn't happen to you. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen to
Mm.
a large variety of people,
That's an
and
excellent point.
maybe it did happen to you and you just didn't notice it. It's like me, all through school, except when I got to Northwestern. All through school, I never had any racism. In all throughout high school, North Carolina School of the Arts, and Oberlin, of course not Oberlin, into the Underground Railroad, in the first place to accept
Yeah,
blacks.
yeah.
I had no racism, none. I wouldn't even think any part of the day that I would have any racism, and most of the time I didn't, have a lot of racism. But Brown was the biggest slap in the face. It changed me forever. It's always going to be something there. It's not something that's going to fade away so quickly. It's always going to be a reference point in my career. It's always going to be mentioned. It's always going to be questioned. But now I'm ready and prepared to respond.
There's someone listening right now who I'm sure wants to learn how they can learn more about the things you've written, your experiences. Maybe there's someone out there ready to hire you to lead a performance of that Bruckner Symphony. How can folks reach out to you and get in contact with you?
Well, of course, you can go to my website, Brandon Keith Brown, Keith, BrandonKeithBrown.com. A lot of my writings are on medium.com, and you can just search for my name. Medium's a large writing platform. Anybody can present there. If you're not a subscription holder, I think it's $5 a month. You can read 3 articles. I think only 3 articles a month or something like that. But you can search for me there. You can read my writing. I also have YouTube, but pretty much all of my stuff on YouTube is on my website. I'm using Instagram a lot. It's very positive. It's just Brandon Keith Brown, conductor. And I would be really happy to have conversations with anybody out there who's listening on Instagram.
I'll pull this around full circle. So in honor of your birthday, if you could choose the repertoire for a concert for you to just go and sit back and just enjoy a beautiful birthday in the concert hall, what would that program be?
Well, oh, well, if it's with a good orchestra, meaning an orchestra that can do historical performance,
Sure.
and an orchestra that has a good conductor or no conductor at all, because I like to believe that the conductor should become less and less necessary, and I also believe that the best music making happens when the conductor is out of the picture. I believe it. Um, I would like to hear a concert of all Mozart,
A Mozart
because
concert.
you know, I am a very, very old-fashioned and musician. You know, just I only need Mozart for the rest. I don't need any other composer. I love most of them deeply, but I don't need anyone except Mozart. And my teacher Gustav Meyer at Peabody, we this was something that made us very close, because we both, we'd sit in classes like, he's the best. We don't need anyone else except him, right? I was like, absolutely. You don't need anyone else. He expresses everything that I feel. I feel like I get him. I know that maybe it sounds a little snotty, because Mozart is one of the most difficult composers to interpret, um, and also difficult to conduct. But for me, I have a very clear picture when I look at the score of what he wants. And sometimes it's wrong, and I prove my interpretation is wrong through studying the music and analysis. but he speaks just so purely and directly and clearly to me. Um, and he's probably the only one that I get this real sense of gratification when I open a score of Mozart and start to study. It's the only one. I mean, other composers, like when you get Brahms. Brahms is wonderful. I love Brahms. We talked a little bit about Brahms. Maybe you'll mention, your love for Brahms too. You don't.
Very
I know you
funny.
don't. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Brahms is fantastic, but Brahms is very frightening. Brahms is very difficult to conduct. It never gets easier. The transitions are very hard. You have a lot of tons of questions, and you have to struggle a lot more. Personally, I do with Brahms music than I do with Mozart. So, I mean, I would love to sit down and hear an extraordinarily well played Mozart. I'm thinking of Pyrrhus playing the piano because I just listened to her last night,
Mhm.
playing any of the piano concertos really, um, and yeah, I mean that would be a wonderful birthday concert for me today.
Wow, I think I'll have to listen to a nice Mozart, piano concerto today. Brandon, I hope these have been the first 2 of many conversations we have. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being a part of Trilloquy. I really appreciate it.
No, it's a great honor for me. Thank you for having me on, Garrett.
Brandon said, just because it isn't happening to you doesn't mean it isn't happening.
I mean,
Take that with you.
it's such a simple concept seemingly, but when you really think about the way, just that concept is missed, how that target is missed over and over again, it's really something to consider, you know?
Yeah.
Just take some of the stories, even what he hasn't mentioned, in our 2 conversations, just, his day-to-day in Germany. If you follow him on social media, he always has a story to tell, and boy, what levels of work we have to do.
We do. All of us.
But it sounds like, despite the COVID-19 epidemic, he's still doing his best and doing some good work. So I really appreciate Brandon Keith Brown for coming on and offering a take. It's hard to explain, Scott, but there's a level of just nerve it takes to really put yourself out there and call these issues out, especially in a field like classical music.
Yeah, yeah, he's got a major target on him, that's for sure. But hats off for the courage, though.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything he had to say. All right, so we're going to lighten things up a little bit on the next opus of Trilloquy. It's our ode to 420. So cheers, Scott.
What's 420?
Oh, well, if you don't know, I guess you'll just have to tune in. We speak with a composer from the East Coast. His name is John Del Vento. We have a really great conversation about music education. Something important I think to think about as we consider what changes we need to make in education. Moving forward in the
Mhm.
in light of this epidemic. This was taped a few weeks back, but I think it's a really great conversation that you'll enjoy, and also the premiere of our new theme. So hope you can stay tuned for the next opus of Trilloquy.
Be well.